In this video, we're going to be looking at some number basics, adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing with signed numbers, meaning there's either a positive or a negative. So we're going to look at this first, adding and subtracting. I'm going to give you the rules and we're going to look at the examples, but we're going to come back to this number line because if we just learn the rules, we will often get them mixed up. So I want you to know the rules, but understand where they come from so that you won't get them mixed up. So when you're adding and subtracting with signed numbers or any numbers, essentially, if you have different signs, that means one positive and one negative, then what you're going to do is subtract and then going to keep the sign of the larger number. Okay, so that's if you have different signs. The other option is to have the same sign. So this is either two positive numbers or two negative numbers. So if that happens, you're just going to add and keep the sign. So before I get to these examples, I just want us to look at this. If I had like -2 plus 1 and -2 minus 1. So let's just look at the difference between those two. If I started here at -2 and then I added 1, I would end up at -1. So that would mean I subtract these two numbers, 2 minus 1 is 1, and keep the sign of the larger number, which was the 2, -1. If I look at this example, if I started back here at -2, but then I took 1 away, the number is becoming more negative, right? Because I'm subtracting 1 off. So it was already a -2. Now it's even further negative and it ends up being -3. So you add those two numbers and then keep the sign. So let's look at these examples down here. They're all the same numbers, like 15 and 4, but the signs are different, positives and negatives. So starting off with -15 plus 4. So the rule says if I have different signs, I'm going to subtract. So 15 minus 4 is easier to think about when you do like -4 minus 15 might be a little fuzzy. So take the bigger number is generally what I do. 15 minus 4 is 11, right? But we're going to keep the sign of the larger number, so that ends up being -11, which makes sense because if I started way back at -15, I want you to try to visualize that on a number line, and I moved up 4 spaces, I'm still negative, right? I didn't get all the way back to 0, but I'm less negative than when I started. All right, if we look at here, -15 minus 4, they're the same sign, so we're going to add those two numbers. 15 plus 4 is 19, but they're both negative, so it ends up being negative, which also makes sense. I started back here at -15, and then I went 4 more negative. So there's no way for me to go positive if I'm just hopping on the number line to the left. The next one is a little different because you are subtracting a negative, and when you subtract a negative, that changes to adding. So we can rewrite this as -15 plus 4, which we've actually already done in that first example. These are now different signs, and so we're going to subtract, take the sign of the higher number, which was the negative. The next one is just pretty straightforward. 15 plus 4 is 19. They're both positive, so we just add them together, and because they were both positive, we keep that positive sign. The next one is also pretty straightforward. 15 minus 4 is 11. There were different signs. When there isn't a sign written in front, we assume it's positive. And so this was positive and then a minus. And so we have different signs. So we subtract and we take the sign of the larger number, which was positive. And remember, if you don't write a sign, that means it's a positive. All right, and this last one right here, just like with this third example, when you subtract a negative, you're really adding. So we can rewrite that as 15 plus 4, which gives us 19. Now that we've looked at adding and subtracting, let's look at multiplying and dividing. So if you are multiplying and dividing, the rules are different because they're different operations. So when you have different signs, when you're multiplying with different signs, it's always going to end up being negative. So the only option here is either a positive and a negative or a negative and a positive. If it's the same sign, which means two positives or two negatives, then it's going to end up being a positive. So let's do some examples of those. The first one is negative 2 times 4. 2 times 4 is 8, and it's going to end up being negative because the signs are different. The next one is just 6 times 5. Both of those are positive, and so our final answer ends up being positive 30. The next one, both of those are negative. A negative times a negative gives me a positive, so that's going to be a positive 12. Notice those signs were the same. For this fourth example, we have negative 7 times 3. A negative times a positive is a negative, so that's negative 21. The next one is, again, a positive times a negative. The order of that doesn't matter. We'll talk more about orders when we talk about the commutative property, but they're different, and so because they're different, they end up being negative. One positive, one negative, ends up being negative 80 there. And the last one, two positive numbers, positive times a positive is still positive.